It was like something out of a movie. The kids had long since gone to bed, but Cindy and her new partner Jason were excited to head outside. People had been talking about tonight's meteor shower for weeks, and they were keen to go out and watch it. They lay there on the hood of Jason's car and looked up at the sky. There were no streetlights around the house, so the view was perfect. It was magical. A moment of genuine peace, after all that had been going on recently. But then it hit Cindy, this sudden feeling of overwhelming dread. Something was wrong. She tried to ignore it, but quickly she sat up, her anxiety making her scan the back garden, looking to see what was there. She felt like they were being watched by someone. As soon as he saw Cindy's reaction, Jason jumped off the car asking what was wrong. He knew well enough by this point that when Cindy felt something was off, then something really was off. Her eyes struggled to make out anything in the darkness, but she was drawn to the old shop, the shed that her husband used to work in before he took his own life. It was like she only caught a quick glimpse of it. Something was there, but before her eyes could quickly focus on it, it was gone. She looked back at Jason, who was still confused, asking Cindy what she was looking for. That was when she saw it again. Over Jason's shoulder was a large old cedar tree. It was dark, but the outline of the tree could just about be made out. But in front of it was a cut-out section of pure darkness. There was something in front of the tree, blocking out the limited light. It was about 15 feet tall, and this darkness seemed to be moving, jerking around in a strange, unnatural way. Cindy went to scream, but before the sound could escape her lips, the dark being shot towards her. She flew backwards, cracking her head on the hood of the car. Cindy screamed out, begging Jason to help her. Jason looked at her in shock. She just seemed to be laying on the hood of the car again. But through Cindy's eyes, she saw something else. The darkness was on top of her, pinning her down. It didn't make a sound, it just pushed down on her, showing her that she was at its mercy, and that no one could help her. Tonight's case takes us to Georgia in 2009 for a strange and terrifying case that saw a young mother losing her husband and very quickly descending into a hellish world of the paranormal that ultimately led to her believing she had been possessed. But is this a true paranormal experience, or the disturbing power of grief and trauma? Well, that's for you to decide. It's time to get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. This is the story of the violent possession of Cindy Sauer. Welcome to the Tape Library. It's tricky to really know where to begin with Cindy's story. The inciting incident that really kicks off this case takes place in 2009, but Cindy's life leading up to this point is full of unusual experiences. This isn't one of those tales where the witness claims to have never believed in ghosts until something happened to them that changed all that. Cindy has always been a firm believer in the paranormal. Cindy met a man named Jim shortly after giving birth to her first child. They fell in love very quickly, but their relationship was difficult, to say the least. Jim was an alcoholic, something that he tried to battle throughout his life. Cindy was carrying her own traumas and darkness, but the pair found a kindred spirit in one another. They had children and moved to a house in Social Circle, Georgia, where they planned to raise their family. But the relationship was constantly messy. Both of them cheated on one another, and despite joining AA, Jim's drinking and partying kept coming back. Cindy increasingly began to feel depressed, and it was during one of these bouts of depression that she first experienced something odd in their home. She became convinced that she could hear a voice whispering to her. Initially, she was sure it sounded just like her grandfather's voice, who had passed away several years prior. But then, other voices seemed to join, until it became just this indecipherable whispering that she would hear when alone in the house. She confided in Jim about it, but she wasn't sure how seriously to take it. Was this just a sign of her worsening mental health? Cindy went to a doctor and was put on medication that she hoped would put an end to all this. But over the months that followed, she would hear things in the house. Footsteps, knocks coming from rooms when no one was in there. She worried that she was losing her mind. But then it all felt a bit more real when Jim started to hear it too. Even claiming at one point he was in bed when it felt like someone ran across the mattress. Someone small, a child perhaps. But of course there was no one there. Eventually the issues in their marriage became too much to handle, and Cindy and Jim split up. Cindy left the house with the children, leaving Jim in the family home. He did not take it well. His general hygiene and mental health quickly spiraled. Cindy would bring the kids to see him each week, and each time they did, he looked worse and worse. It wasn't a clean break. It couldn't be, given the circumstances. And time again, Jim tried to get Cindy back, but the marriage was too far gone. One evening, the children had gone with Jim to a restaurant for a meal. One of Cindy's daughters later claimed that he just seemed to be staring out across the restaurant at nothing, just fixated on a spot in the distance. But then, more troublingly, they described that his face seemed to suddenly change. Not just a weird expression, but as if his face had momentarily turned into someone else, before suddenly returning back to their father. It scared the children to such an extent that they worried about being around him. Shortly after this incident, Cindy received a call from a neighbour close to the house. She was told she needed to get there as soon as she could. Jim had taken his own life. He had sat on the edge of their bed and pulled the trigger. Cindy was understandably distraught. Despite the relationship not working out, they still had strong feelings for one another, and the children no longer had their father. What's more, many people in their community instantly blamed Cindy for Jim's death. It went so far that she started to receive death threats. Cindy felt very alone in the weeks following Jim's death, but she didn't feel like she could just uproot the children's life and begin again elsewhere. Defiantly, she decided to stay. She moved back into the family home with the children, and that was when things really began. They hadn't been back in the house for too long at this point. A lot of work was needed to get it back into a reasonable state, especially in the back garden that was overgrown and messy. It was a sunny afternoon. Cindy had been working on the garden with her second daughter, Chastity, and her friend Steve. It was time for lunch, so Cindy headed inside to make sandwiches, while the two teenagers relaxed on the porch. It was as she was prepping the food that Cindy heard a loud screech from outside. Steve came running into the kitchen, stumbling over his words, but Cindy quickly understood. Something was wrong with Chastity. They both rushed outside to find her daughter on the floor, curled up in the fetal position, in tears. Steve told Cindy that they had just been sitting there talking, when suddenly Chastity began screaming. and then fell to the floor. She seemed terrified. Cindy got her inside, and after a few minutes the young girl managed to regain her composure to explain what had happened. She said she'd been sitting on the porch when she suddenly caught something out of the corner of her eye. She looked over at the old workshop where her father spent much of his time. Standing there, leaning against a tree next to it, was Jim. Just standing there, staring back at his daughter. He didn't move, he didn't make a sound. He just stared at Chastity. With all she had experienced throughout her life, Cindy didn't try to reassure Chastity that she was mistaken or anything like that. She believed her. Instead, she got up, stormed out towards the workshop, and began shouting loudly at Jim, yelling at him for scaring their daughter, demanding to know where he was. As she was shouting, something whipped past her head and landed on the ground by her feet. She picked it up. It was a silver lug nut from a 1970 Camaro. She knew it instantly, because that was the car that she and Jim had repaired together many years ago. Cindy threw it back into the bushes and stormed back inside. It was after this that Chastity started to have a recurring nightmare. She kept seeing her dad's final moments over and over in her dreams. But one night there was something different about this dream. Next to her father stood a tall, dark figure. It was hard to describe what it looked like. Chastity referred to it as distorted, but she heard it speaking, encouraging her father to do it. Chastity broke out of the dream, suddenly awake in her bed, drenched in sweat. But as she glanced around the room to get her bearings, she saw it. That same tall, dark figure, standing at the foot of her bed. Once again, Cindy came rushing into the sound of her daughter screaming. But as she flicked on the bedroom light, there was nothing there. In the months that followed, Cindy gave birth to another baby, and her attention was purely focused on that. There were odd moments in the house, cabinet doors opening by themselves, strange sounds. But for the most part, the family didn't pay it too much attention. After around 9 months though, it was getting harder and harder to ignore. Cindy had also begun to notice an odd sensation, as though someone was standing close to her at times. Someone she couldn't see, but could just feel their presence. One evening, Cindy's niece Jessica came over to babysit the children. Cindy had met a new man, an ex-pastor called Jason. He seemed like a really good guy, and the children got on with him. He was exactly the kind of calming presence they needed in their life after all that had gone on. Jessica offered to look after the children so Cindy and Jason could go out. But Cindy got a phone call during her date from a clearly upset Jessica, who said she had seen something strange, something that had terrified her. There had been a Bible laying on the chest of drawers in one of the bedrooms. Jessica had been in there, putting the baby to sleep, when it suddenly flew off the unit, zipped past her, and fell to the floor. She couldn't explain how it happened, but it spooked her enough to call Cindy. Cindy came straight home. When she arrived, Jessica was with the baby in the living room. She refused to go back into the bedroom. Cindy went to investigate, but she didn't just see the Bible on the ground as Jessica had stated. Someone had ripped it apart. The remains of the pages were all over the floor of the bedroom. She placed the ruined Bible back in its place, next to Jim's ashes. She was in that room again just a few days later, bent over to unfasten the baby from the car seat that she had just brought her inside in, when something grabbed her from behind with such a force that it nearly sent Cindy flying. She described it as a masculine feel, a man grabbing her behind. She spun around, but there was no one there, just the ashes and the ruined Bible. After this, the dreams began for Cindy, terrifying dark dreams that would keep her up half the night. But being awake didn't stop these images flooding her head. Soon she began to become convinced that she was seeing her husband's final moments too, hearing him speak to an unseen person before putting the gun to his head. As 2011 began, it felt like the activity in the home had started to die down. The longer time passed without any experiences, the easier it became to simply dismiss what had come before. The family had undergone a pretty extreme trauma. Their minds could be playing tricks on them, missing the obvious explanations. It was shortly after Christmas when Jason was round again, enjoying a glass of wine with Cindy on the sofa. The gentle hum of the TV was the only sound, when suddenly their peaceful night was interrupted by 3 loud knocks on the door. Cindy turned to Jason, clearly a little concerned. Who would be calling this late? Jason jumped up and offered to go see who it was. Cindy remained on the sofa as he pulled the front door open. He glanced back at Cindy with a puzzled look on his face. There was no one there. But then Cindy jumped up, shouting out to Jason, "Did you see that?" Just to the left of Jason was a window. Cindy saw something through it, like a grey mist moving past the window. The pair stepped outside, but there was no sign that anyone was there. That was when Cindy decided to sit Jason down and tell him about the strange things she had been seeing. But to her surprise, he didn't seem scared off. He not only believed her, but also seemed quite fascinated by the whole thing. Any hopes that things were truly calming down were quickly squashed when Chastity told her mother that she had walked into the kitchen one morning, only to see the same tall, shadowy figure from her bedroom standing there, as tall as the door frame, featureless. Just this dark figure that had elongated limbs facing towards her, before it slowly began to move away from Chastity and towards the baby's room, where it just seemed to vanish. Still, the idea persisted. Could this just be grief? Maybe this wasn't the right environment for her children to be in, and Cindy seriously considered moving away. But then Jason came in one day, claiming he had just chased away an intruder from their garden. He said there was someone out by the old workshop in the garden. When Cindy asked what the trespasser looked like, Jason seemed to struggle to describe them. He just said they were very tall, but it was too dark to make out any features. To Cindy, it sounded exactly like what Chastity had been seeing. Could it be Jim? There were so many sightings around the workshop that he spent so much time in. The activity in the baby's room where his ashes were kept. Was he just demonstrating to them that he was still there? It simultaneously scared and comforted Cindy, and this excitement about the whole thing sort of re-sparked her interest in the paranormal, a fact that would lead to a serious mistake on her part. It's important to note that although terrifying at times, these events were not a constant in the family's life. It had been 2 years now since Jim had taken his own life, and while odd things did seem to happen in the house fairly often, a lot of these bigger moments were rather spread out, It becomes easier to dismiss things in cases like this. The longer a gap between events, the more time your brain has to rationalise things, to think that this isn't as bad as you maybe thought. But Cindy was certainly stressed, even if she had put it down to grief at times rather than the activity. She was losing weight. She didn't look like herself. Jason also suggested they should move away, but it seemed like Cindy couldn't bring herself to do that yet. And between singing in a band, taking care of her kids, and maintaining a still fairly new relationship, she had lots of opportunities to distract herself, to bury down that feeling that something was wrong. As I said, Cindy's interest in the paranormal was returning in a big way, and it was during one of these quieter periods that she saw it again for the first time in a long time. It was in Covington, this large colonial home that had long been abandoned. She had been drawn to it before. It fascinated her. What had happened here? Why had it been left empty for so long? But it was on this September day, as she drove past, that she had an idea. She had been ghost hunting many times in the past, and the topic of ghosts had been a constant theme in her and Jason's conversations over the last few months. So she suggested to him that they do one together. And this house, which seemed to be calling to her, seemed like the perfect option. It was later that week that they returned. Their investigation was intended as a bit of fun, but they decided to split it into two. Chastity had come along on the trip to look after the baby, and they had plans to visit a haunted attraction later in the day. But first, Cindy and Jason would go to the house to get a sense of what the place was like, before returning later that night for their proper investigation. After scouting out the perimeter, they discovered, much to their delight, that one of the windows at the back had been left unlocked. With Chastity keeping watch from the car in the drive, the pair slipped in silently through the window. It seemed like someone had begun renovation works on the place, but seemingly abandoned the project partway through. The floors were covered in dust and plastic sheeting. New electrical wiring had been put in. But the deeper they moved into the house, Cindy's sense of excitement slowly turned to unease. She wasn't sure why. She had wanted to explore this place for months, but now she was here, something felt off. Despite this, they continued to explore, recording on their phones as they went. When Cindy noticed the door to the basement, she rushed forward to pull it open and told Jason to follow her. But as soon as she opened it, she instantly screamed and slammed it shut again. Jason asked what was wrong. Cindy took a moment to regain her composure before saying there was someone down there. There was a man at the bottom of the stairs. They worried they had been caught, but the man didn't come racing up the stairs to see who was in his house. The pair stood in silence for a minute, listening carefully, before Jason slowly opened the door. There was no one there. And that was when Cindy began to question exactly what she had seen. She thought it was a man, but it was dark, shadowy. The unease returned to Cindy, and she said to Jason that she wanted to leave, which they quickly did. They returned late that night under cover of darkness. Cindy was still feeling apprehensive, but she didn't want to let on to Jason. She worried he might call the whole thing off, and for some reason, she felt like this was important, that she needed to visit the house again. They approached the back of the house. Jason took out their audio recorders and started talking out loud, attempting to communicate with whatever might have been there. But Cindy didn't join in. She was quiet, distracted. She felt like there was something there. Not inside the house, but outside with them. In fact, she was convinced that she had just seen someone's shadow running behind the trees on the other end of the garden. Then it passed again, this time on their right-hand side. Jason went quiet as he saw it too. It seemed like someone, possibly more than one person, was out there with them. She suddenly shushed Jason when she heard something. She was convinced it was the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. Someone was pulling up to the house, and her first thought was that someone had called the police. But when they rushed back around to the front of the house, there was no one there. Just their car sat in the darkness of the long drive. They headed back to the vehicle. Despite it being a warm night, Cindy began to shiver. Then the wind suddenly picked up. It was odd. Cindy looked around as they stood by the car, and she was sure she saw it again, running past the hedges and the trees. The shadow. That tall shadow. But then she started catching things in the corner of her eye. Smaller moving objects. Just out there in the dark. Cindy started to panic. She turned to open the passenger door, telling Jason that they needed to leave. But before she could get inside, she heard a loud crash. Cindy looked back, and barreling towards her was what she could only describe as a huge wavy vapour. Just this 40-foot wall of darkness headed quickly in her direction. Cindy had a moment of realization as she remembered the object moving past the window when they heard the knocks on their door that night months prior. She jumped into the car, and Jason started to drive quickly. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he could see the very real fear that Cindy was experiencing. He couldn't hear it, but as they drove down the drive, all Cindy could hear in her ears was screaming. Jason stopped at the end of the drive, and the screaming in Cindy's ears stopped with it. But then she began to shake again. She whispered for Jason to pray for her. He didn't understand, but then it was like she lost total control of her body, convulsing in her seat. She could see Jason talking to her, but all she could hear was guttural growls. It was as if something were taking over her body, as she described it, wearing her like a glove. But as quickly as it started, it seemed to stop. Cindy regained consciousness. They drove for a few blocks before Cindy said she needed some air. As they pulled into a parking lot, Cindy's mind went back to the house. She had this sudden fear that something had been trying to lure her inside, something that wanted to keep her there. Jason could see it was happening again. She was acting weird. Jason kept asking her what her name was, trying to keep her present. But every time he spoke, she grew angrier and angrier at him. She wanted to lash out, she wanted to hurt him. And that was when she let out a bizarre hissing sound. And Jason became convinced that just for a moment, her face changed. Cindy began to struggle for breath, and Jason began to pray over her once again. Eventually she was able to breathe again, and she fell into Jason's arms, sobbing. If it had been something in that house, or something that had already been following her and sensed its opportunity, she couldn't say, but Cindy knew that something had latched onto her that night. Something dark. In the weeks that followed, the nightmares got more constant and vivid. The strange activity, the sounds, the objects moving, all seemed to increase, but now they were joined by the occasional disembodied voice, whispering on the wind. Cindy seemed to grow irrationally angry at random moments, and then suddenly returned to normal in an instant. It was the night of the meteor shower in October that she first realised that this wasn't a one-off occurrence. She was attacked again. They'd been sitting on the hood of Jason's car watching the night sky, when she once again saw the shadow figure out in the darkness. It lunged towards her, pinning her down. Jason, unable to see anything, just reverted to what had previously worked and began to hold on to Cindy and pray. After several minutes of screaming, crying and praying, whatever it was released Cindy, leaving her terrified on the ground in Jason's arms. Despite believing in the paranormal, Cindy did not believe in demons. Ghosts she could wrap her head around. Ghosts are what she was convinced she had been seeing since her childhood. But demons, well, they were just from movies. The demons in the Bible were just metaphors. But as the weeks progressed, this belief was tested time and time again. She would wake up in the morning after a night of disturbed sleep to find herself covered in scratches and bruises. It became clear, though, that something wasn't coming into her room and doing this. Cindy was doing it to herself. She began punching herself, hurting herself during the day. It would come out of nowhere, this sudden need to do harm to herself. But if she tried to resist, she could hear it. The voice in her head had suddenly returned, a voice that seemed to push her towards every worst instinct that she had, a voice that kept telling her no one could help her. The sounds in the house began to change too. Cindy would lie in her bed awake at night to the sounds of scratching, as if something large was dragging its claws along the inside of the house's walls, and it wasn't just her that would hear it. Jason and Chastity were very convinced that something was happening, even though the rest of the children were luckily oblivious to what was going on with their mother. One night, Cindy was convinced that she heard a long, low, guttural growl coming from the darkened corner of her bedroom. That same growl that she had heard the night it had first attacked her. She tried to ignore it, but then she heard it again. Closer this time. Cindy pulled the covers over her head so that she couldn't see it, but she could feel its presence hovering over her. She began to notice that each time the presence made itself known, it was accompanied by a deep thud, something she described as sounding like a sonic boom. She became convinced that it was originating from a specific spot in her ceiling each time, almost as if it were dropping down through a portal, from its world into ours. The attacks seemed to become more frequent. On numerous occasions, Cindy would claim that the shadowy figure would take over her. She would convulse, she would lose the ability to control her own body. Her thoughts became messy and jumbled, as though she were no longer alone in her own head. She would say horrible things to her family and friends, in a voice she did not recognize. She would want to hurt herself. Every time Jason would pray, it seemed to be the only thing that seemed to help. But whenever he did, Cindy would grow enraged, as if the words themselves were hurting her, before suddenly returning to her normal self. Whenever these attacks happened, Cindy noted that her movements became unnatural and jerky when she saw the entities. This is how she described their movements. She said they don't move as we do. It's different. And when they take over your body, they have to learn to move within the confines of a human body. During one attack, when she briefly glanced at herself in the mirror, as she stumbled around the room in an awkward, jerky motion, she didn't recognize the face looking back at her. Cindy explained later that it seemed to be how possession works. It's not a constant that once one of these entities enters you, it takes over. It's a battle. They keep trying, entering for a few moments before losing control. But with each subsequent attack, it felt like they were able to control Cindy better and better, and she soon began to worry that eventually there would be no coming back for her. She also noted that this wasn't a single entity as such. There was the large shadowy one, but there also seemed to be smaller entities, that she would see darting about from time to time, but it was like these different beings had somehow merged together to create this force that was now coming after her. All these things needed was an invitation, and somehow she had invited something to focus its attention on her. The constant attacks grew increasingly frequent. Cindy worried that it was only a matter of time before she either lost her mind, hurt herself in a more serious way, or worse still, hurt someone she cared about. But who could she turn to? Jason was trying his best, but this was something neither of them had ever encountered before. She worried about speaking to doctors or professionals. What if they thought she was crazy? And tried to take the children away. So she started researching groups that specialised in this kind of thing. For the most part, she just dismissed them. But when she stumbled upon a website for a group known as the Paranormal Detectives of Georgia, she felt like they seemed a much more professional group than just some kids who wanted to be Ghostbusters. Even if they couldn't help her, maybe they knew someone who could, so she reached out. After a conversation going over everything that had happened, they set a time to meet. It would be a week later, and the entire time leading up to it, the voice that now seemed to be ever present in Cindy's head was trying to convince her to call it off, to not meet with them. But with some nervousness, she forced through and met the investigation group. During an attempt to communicate with the entities, the group asked whether they could turn off the lights. Cindy reluctantly agreed. Quickly, her eyes started to dart around the room. She said the entities moved better in the dark. It was like they were freer to do so. They could move faster. She saw them flittering about in the darkened corners of the room, though seemingly no one else could. She watched as the medium who had come along asked questions, but the entities were not answering. They were joining up with one another to create it yet again. The hulking giant formation that she had seen numerous times now. And then it proceeded to move towards her. Another attack began. Cindy began to contort in her chair, making unnatural sounds between terrifying cackles of laughter. Her face stretched to an almost impossible degree. Cindy's mind was full of rage and hate. As the session drew to an end, the medium simply stated that she thought Cindy should speak to a priest they knew. They didn't feel any further investigation was warranted. She needed an exorcism. The priest who came to Cindy's home was Father Darren Simpson, but before his arrival, those same doubts began to overtake Cindy. She shouldn't do this. She needed to call it off, virtually having a panic attack about it. Jason tried to reassure her that they were doing the right thing, and she seemed to calm down momentarily. But as soon as he left the room to let the priest and the investigators in, Cindy's mind went to a very dark place. She heard the voice in her head once again. It was saying it wanted to know what she looked like inside. Cindy walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer where the knives were. Luckily for Cindy, Jason had preempted this. He had removed all the sharp objects from the house. Whatever was inside Cindy was filled with rage. Jason returned just in time to witness her launching a box full of Jim's belongings across the room, smashing it into the wall. Jason tried to keep Cindy calm as the priest began his work. Her reactions alternated constantly. One second she was begging and pleading Jason for help. The next she was shouting foul comments and screeching in anger, threatening to kill everyone in the room. She struggled to breathe, her vision went blurry, and her body stiffened. It was like consciousness was shutting down. But still Jason held her tight, and the priest spoke the words that he needed to speak. Jason struggled to keep Cindy restrained, and it required several of them to keep her in place. Inside Cindy's head, she described it as chaos, a flurry of voices and images, so many that it caused her to begin slamming her head into the floor, as the others all tried desperately to stop her from hurting herself. At one point, Cindy became convinced that she felt something biting her. The priest witnessed her eyes glaze over with a white film, before demanding to know who had taken control of Cindy. Though it seemed to fight this impulse, through Cindy's lips a name was spoken, a name she refuses to reveal to this day. But with this name, the priest suddenly had what he needed. The chaos in her mind seemed to be continuing, but then there was a sudden silence. Cindy drew the deepest breath that she had ever pulled into her lungs. It was like coming to the surface after nearly drowning. The priest simply said to her, "Welcome back, child." The activity in the house didn't stop as such, but it was much more mild and less consistent. Still, Cindy felt she was free of whatever this darkness was. She finally scattered Jim's ashes, and soon afterwards said goodbye to the house, moving out for good. In 2012, not long after the events had occurred, the producers of the show A Haunting reached out to Cindy and asked to feature her story on their show. What they presented was a much more simplified version of the events that took place. So in 2018, she published her own book to explain the full story, which she said was intended to help survivors of incidents like this, to let them know that they are not alone. The show frames everything as though it ends in resolution. Cindy's own book supports that impression to a degree, suggesting that after the exorcism, things largely returned to normal. But in a rare interview conducted after the book was published, Cindy offered a very different detail in passing. The disturbances, she said, had come back, and at one point, they were severe enough that she underwent a second exorcism. If Cindy Sauer is free from what she experienced today, I do not know. But what is clear is that the story was never as neatly resolved as it first appeared. And whatever followed her through that house may not have fully left. So what really happened? Reading Cindy's book, I'll admit I was not particularly convinced by her accounts. The book feels very dramatic at times, and there is a real theme of good and evil running throughout it, with a lot of pretty heavy Christian elements to it. I just felt a little like I've seen this story before time and time again, especially in a lot of American paranormal books. The note on the front cover reads, "A novel by Cindy Sauer, based on a true story," raising the question in my mind at the time of whether this was a fictional version of the events. But based on other information I've gathered, it seems that this is intended to be an accurate retelling of the events from Cindy's perspective. But it was upon hearing her interviewed directly that I started to turn around on Cindy's story. I've said this a few times in the past, but I think hearing someone tell their story in their own voice gives you a sense of not whether a story is true or not, but whether this person at least believes what they are saying is true. I think it's harder to get a sense of sincerity through the written words, but hearing them talk off the cuff about what happened can often feel more convincing. Of course, that doesn't prove anything, but it just gives a human element to an unbelievable claim. There is something I really was drawn to in Cindy's account though, and that was some of the little odd details about the haunting late on. That something was seemingly haunting their family home, but the possession element only began after visiting a building she claimed she felt she was drawn to over and over. This idea of the entity sort of falling into reality, accompanied by a sound, which is a detail I don't think I've really heard before in other cases. I was also taken by her very vivid descriptions of what it felt like when she believed she was possessed. The haunting episode makes it feel like this story starts with Jim's death, but Cindy's book paints her experiences with the paranormal as a lifelong thing. I've decided to mostly focus on post-gym events in this episode, as I think this is the more relevant information regarding the actual haunting and possession, but a huge chunk of the book is dedicated to Cindy's earlier experiences, and they are very interesting if you want to check it out. In an interview given some years later, Cindy addressed the point that it's tricky to know who to turn to in these situations. Most people are just going to think you're crazy, and at times she had to wrestle with that idea herself. What if she was losing her mind? She had spoken to therapists in the past, dealt with depression before. What if this was just an escalation of these past issues? But as time progressed, it became clearer and clearer to her that this wasn't just in her head. Others were experiencing things too. While so much of it was only witnessed by her, she certainly wasn't alone. Numerous others claimed to see some of these entities. At times, both Jason and Chastity both said they saw the shadow figures, but seemingly not as often as Cindy. Could she have been influencing them with her beliefs? Or was there really something following them? But we see it time and time again in cases where people report these kinds of extreme hauntings. Grief, depression, darkness. We saw it with Julian Shadowman in Yorkshire, the troubling claims of the Sauer family, even the hopeless circumstances surrounding the Shepton mine incident. And it creates a real sticking point for skeptics and believers alike, because it raises an uncomfortable question. Just how reliable are our minds during periods of extreme emotional distress? Are we seeing the limits of our mind's ability to process reality when weighed down by grief, stress and trauma? For that reason, this story really did remind me of the Shadow Man episode and Julian's experiences with it. There are actually so many similarities, including that shadow being that seems to at times run. And it makes me wonder if he would have gone down a similar path to Cindy if enough time had passed. When we lose someone we care deeply about, it is only natural for our thoughts to turn towards the possibility of an afterlife, or some other world beyond the one we can see. And perhaps, in that search for meaning, we begin to see things that aren't really there, or begin linking otherwise explainable events into a narrative we are unknowingly creating for ourselves, shaping reality through perception. But those who believe in the paranormal may look at it through a different lens. Perhaps grief, depression and stress do alter our perception. Perhaps they do place us in a different state of mind. But that doesn't mean what these people are experiencing isn't real. Maybe it simply makes them more willing to notice the strange, rather than immediately dismissing it. If they hear a bump in the night, their mind doesn't jump straight to a pipe cooling in the wall. Instead they ask, what if? And perhaps it is only when we allow ourselves to ask that question that we begin to glimpse whatever may lie beyond the veil. But there is a third possibility, and when it comes to a potential supernatural explanation for Cindy's experience, it may be the most relevant of all. What if these feelings of pain and loss don't draw our attention towards another world, but draw another world's attention towards us? What if in our lowest moments, something notices, something begins to watch, something begins to interact, and the darker the situation becomes, the more it is drawn to it, the more it feeds. It's a terrifying thought. This idea that the shadows are just lying in wait, waiting for their moment, when the light will fade and darkness will take over. That's all for this entry into the tape library. I actually set out to make this episode last winter, but it turned out there were two Cindys with very similar surnames who had cases featured on a haunting, and halfway through researching those stories got jumbled, so this was the episode I had intended to make when I released the Cindy Sarrow episode. back in December. If you want to delve into this one deeper, I'd personally suggest checking out Cindy's book, The Exorcism of Cindy Sauer, and her 2-part interview with the podcast The Grave Talks, both of which I think give you a more rounded overview of the events than the show did. I do just want to say that if you are struggling with your mental health, then please do not jump into an otherworldly explanation for what you are experiencing. That's not to dismiss anyone's beliefs or experiences, and I'm not saying this is what happened with Cindy, but your first step should always be to think about the more logical explanations. If you're going through a tough time, please do reach out and speak to a professional. I speak from personal experience when I say that despite how alone you may feel at times, there are people who can help. In a lot of ways, this was quite a heavy one. I'm not sure in an exact order, but I've got some really fun topics picked out for the coming months. From what I believe is a first trip to Scotland for the show, to a very strange UFO encounter, and even the odd world of haunted paintings. So if you don't want to miss out on any of those, please be sure to follow or subscribe. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams. This episode was made possible by my supporters on Patreon, so it's time to read out their credits. First up, our tape library archivist Michelle, Nexor EH, Guillotine, Alex Wiles, Michelle Desnoyer, Orson Wells, Paranormal Phoenix, Swiss Tony 10, Meow Mare, The Laughing Tabby, Cereza Wells, Alice, Julian M, Eulanthropus Blood, Jennifer, Shan Harding, Melissa Waldrote, Adam M, Cryptic Clyde, Adam Grantham, The Magic Pumpkin, Lucas Wiles, Yenok, Aurora, Lee Borix Johnson, Now and Zen, Pat McShay, Pantherpaw, The Elusive M, The Bisexual Moon Cult, Emulated Phoenix, Jamie Long, Dammit David and Marcus, G Martinez, Lisa Mary Sheridan, Gaffrey with a G, Plum Blossom, Gina Britton, Emily Carlin, Sarah Boyd, Thomas Boatwright, Stephen Lutman, Crystal E, West Virginia Vegetable Man, Dawn Swan, Tina S, Sean Miller, Juno, Joseph Condola, Jolly Jedi, Pixelina, Joe, The Crimson DM Detective, Jean Janine, Darla, Alfredo Sandoval, Midia Zabine, Dominic DeAngelis, Dagon O'Dorleg, Judith Hacker, Eric Salas, Mirashard, Adeline, Ash Loves Books, Gabrielle, Umiko Grimm, and Sandy Lusk. Then we have our amazing lead archivist, Summer Chambers, Bunny Gasmask, Sage, Dr. Thunderous Phantom PhD, Sandy W, Yvonne Rivers, Jennifer, Amy Stubblefield, The Original Deer, Emmy Bartley, Lady Bette Noir, Ridiculous, London Grace, Melissa Harrison, Emperor Franz, Plague Doctor is in, Xavier Angle, Sag Kelly, Alex O'Neill, Tyler Michael, Alex Goldberg, Vaniel, Brian Baker, 1000th Ghost. And our insanely generous Grand Overseers, Lauren Murray, Sarcastic, Win Lewis, The God Emperor of Mankind, Old Soul Like Mine, Harrison the Ogre Shannon in Seattle, Leah Carmella, Bad Diddle, Katie, Morning Rain 2619, Agent 355, and Queen of Flatulence. Thank you so much to all of them, all of my junior archivists and my members on YouTube. Each and every one of you plays a huge part in keeping the show going. If you want to join the archivists, links can be found in the description. Thank you.